don't know if Trump's making a case for peace, but he certainly is making a strong case to have him put on one of those white jackets with the long sleeves that they tie around your back, known as a straitjacket, and then they haul you off to an asylum. His behavior is so bizarre, but what's frightening is it's not limited to him. So he has what I've found so alarming over the course of the last 3 weeks, and particularly that week from December 28th, Sunday, until Saturday, that was January 5th, I believe, when he, on the 28th, he launched the coup against the Iranian government, kicking off the protests over the economy. He was meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky while the U.S. was helping Ukraine launch an attack to kill President Putin. And then he closed off the week by kidnapping Nicolas Maduro. And then with all that having under his belt and having almost carried out a military attack on Iran last Tuesday, he has now doubled down by declaring openly he does not recognize, respect anything about international law. That is useless. It's whatever he thinks is right and what needs to be done. Now, it'd be one thing if say, well, that's just Donald Trump talking crazy talk, but it's been repeated by his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller. It's been endorsed by Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and it's been endorsed and promoted by Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury. Now, I've not seen or heard anything out of Pete Hegseth's mouth, but as his newly designated Secretary of War, I'm sure he's all in on this. So if you're Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, or hell, Starmer or Macron or Merz, you got to look at the United States and say there's something very, very different going on here. While it's true that most countries in the world, or the big powers in the world, have from time to time found ways to overlook or circumvent international law, they've still sort of maintained some sort of verbal commitment to it, and seen it as preferable to have as opposed to not having. But now Trump is just openly saying it means nothing. He's matched his words with actions, having walked away from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement during his last term as president, which, it's not just Trump who's flouting international law. George W. Bush canceled the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty Agreement. And now, even though Russia's trying to say, hey, let's keep New START alive, Trump and his administration are showing absolutely zero interest in doing that. So you have this complete breakdown of the international system. And, a year ago, I don't think any of us would have predicted that we'd be sitting here in the middle of January watching NATO come apart at the seams because the United States is claiming that there's a Chinese or Russian threat to Greenland. Okay, well, under the NATO framework, if there is such a threat, you activate Article 5 and you get all of NATO to say, yeah, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to protect Greenland from Russia and China. But Trump is saying, oh, no, we don't need NATO to protect Greenland. We'll do it. We'll take it. We'll take you over. We'll do it. And even if Greenland and Denmark don't like it, too bad. We're going to take it from you by force. And Europe is stuck trying to figure out, they want to oppose it, but they still want the United States. They still want to get the monthly check from the United States. And so I've likened it. This is very much like on the personal level when you have an abusive spouse. One spouse, physically abuses, beats up the other, and the victim never reports it to the police, never gets a restraining order, never packs up and leaves. They stay in this toxic relationship. So that's where we are. Europe is now in a toxic relationship, and the pettiness of Donald Trump, which was expressed in that recent letter to Norway, basically saying, okay, you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, so therefore I'm not inclined to support peace anymore. I'm gonna do things that are in my interest. Well, there's an astonishing admission, and so this is, I frankly see this as the beginning of the end of NATO, or it's the end of the beginning, and now we're going to see NATO come apart at the seams. Because how can you continue to be in a relationship with a person or a country that is this abusive to you? I don't get, and I'll ask this to you. Have the European leaders lost all self-respect?
Well, short answer, I would say yes. Well, this is the problem, I think, over time, that the Europeans made themselves so dependent on the United States. And I often make the comparison with any civil war, because it's the same thing. That is that once you have two parties fighting, they will always become excessively dependent on the external party to the extent they lose control over the policies themselves. And it's often in alliance systems as well. The more intense the conflict becomes, the more dependent they become on the protector. So this is why when the Cold War came to an end, the Europeans saw an opportunity to become more independent. That's when they started to talk about strategic autonomy and European sovereignty and all these issues. So but this is the problem we see now. All these things have failed, especially because of the war in Ukraine. The Europeans made themselves so dependent on the US for security, and of course, economically, as the world became more multipolar, the Europeans wanted to revive the collective hegemony. So they started cutting themselves off from Russia, China, well, any other ones that the US asked, and in hope that we would somehow restore the unipolar moment. But in reality, it just made us more dependent at a time when the US had to adjust to multipolarity going other places. So no, I think the Europeans made themselves so dependent on the US. The US can do whatever it wants now. In your analogy, the beaten spouse, I think Europeans have nowhere to go. It's just go back and get some more beating, I think. Regarding this letter, though, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, he wrote a letter to the Norwegian Prime Minister, again, writing that he no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace, and then he links it directly to the threat of annexing Greenland. And it's, you give me the Nobel Peace Prize or I will invade some territory. I mean, this is, it is quite extraordinary. I mean, it's pretty funny as well if if the Danes are losing some territory. This is kind of a funny way to lose it. It actually has another funny element to it, which is that Trump says that Russia and China wants to take Greenland, that their warships are in the area, all of this stuff. They're not. This is nonsense. However, Denmark, its own intelligence agencies have been making reports about this, that Greenland, that the Russians might come for Greenland. And the reason is they wanted to further, inflate the Russia threat. So America would commit further to Europe. But they might have overplayed the card, because now Trump can turn it back on them, saying, well, you're not capable of defending against Russia, so we will take it then, because it's too important for world peace for Denmark to take care of it. So the Danes might have undermine themselves with their own war propaganda.
Well, so I'm going to take full advantage of the fact that I've got a professor of history here. I'm holding you hostage. So as I look at the sort of the evolution of Europe and this acceptance of international law, sort of the first move of it was with the Magna Carta, where the nobles came to King John and said basically, hey, you don't get to do whatever you want just because it feels right or you're the moral superior. We're gonna lay out some limitations on what you can do. And the rest of Europe sort of came along, and would you mark the Treaty of Westphalia as sort of the beginning point where most of Europe said, okay, we're gonna rally around this concept of international law? Or can you pin it down to any particular moment?
No, I think Magna Carta and all, I think it's better to tie it directly to Britain. I think Peace of Westphalia is more established a modern world order, because instead of having a hegemonic system, it created a world order based on a balance of power as the source of peace. Because what we noticed over those 30 years from 1618 to 1648 was that no one European power was able to assert dominance. So every time it looked like one might win, there would form a natural balancing against it. So after all this killing, it became evident that there wouldn't be one power. And that's why Europe accepted that there will have to be an international anarchy, which meant, not that it's a complete chaos, but just that there won't be one power that will centralize control. And essentially all states will then compete for security, and peace then derives from having a balance of power. This is very different from the former system. But within this framework, you need rules, because this is where modern diplomacy begins to emerge. This is when you have to set up some some rules for what we can do. I mean, this is all based on international law. You give up some foreign policy flexibility, so you can't do whatever you want. But in return, you get reciprocity, you get predictability. And yes, the US can't just seize Greenland if it wants, but then it knows other countries can't do the same. So it's more stable, and which is why it's crazy now to see the president of the United States denounce international law as if it's some woke ploy to weaken the United States. It's it's very strange.
Well, because this entire concept of international law was supposed to prevent the very big, the most powerful from being able to just abuse and bully the smallest. It was to provide some sort of leveling that different nations, regardless of size, could be taken as sovereign and be treated as an equal, at least in theory. But what I've heard out of the Trump administration and Trump's supporters, there's a comedian in the United States by the name of Dave Smith, who is a libertarian, and he was debating a fellow named Dinesh D'Souza, who has been, you call him sort of one of the neocon supporters. And D'Souza was making, and D'Souza is a very smart guy. I mean, well learned from a university standpoint. But he was making the argument that basically we could do whatever we want to Venezuela because they're smaller and they're weaker. Well, yeah, that's like the adult saying, hey, I can sexually exploit these children, or I can physically abuse them in other ways because they're smaller and they can't fight back. But what are you going to do about it? Well, that's why we got actually some laws and rules governing what adults can and cannot do to children. It's the same principle, and they're now breaking that out into international relations. That Denmark, small, tiny, we can take it in a day. They can't fight back. And so I looked at that and I said, how does that differ from what Adolf Hitler did with respect to taking control of Czechoslovakia? And I guess that was 1938, 39. It's the same kind of thing. Now, I know that Alex Krainer has written extensively recently. I haven't had a chance to read his full series, but that, he brings some other insights that, it's not quite like the story we're told, but still it gets back to this, that either you've got some rules governing how countries behave towards one another, or you don't. And once you break away from that, it then turns out to a battle for who's the strongest and who's the most ruthless. And unfortunately, it looks like the United States is stepping into that. And Trump, there's nobody around Trump to say, hey, Mr. President, you can't do that. Or if you do that, you're going to destroy NATO. Now, personally, I have no problem with destroying NATO. I think that it's an anachronism. But, I don't know if Trump is deliberately set out to do that, but that's going to be the likely outcome when all is said and done here, that he will have undermined the legitimacy of NATO and make it difficult to continue.
Yeah, no, I think NATO's dying as well. And I have to tip my hat to Colonel Douglas McGregor, who called it essentially on the first week of Russia invading Ukraine that the consequence of this would not be NATO growing stronger, but dying. But in regards to international law, though, I think to some extent, at least as a political realist, I'm inclined to think that even law tends to reflect the distribution of power. That is, after World War II, we had a balance of power with two main powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. But when there is a balance of power in this sense, that they can constrain each other, I think international law often reflects this. So the UN Charter, which came out of World War II, it will put mutual constraint on both sides. And that's essentially what the UN Charter is. That is, it assumes some sovereign equality, same rules for both sides. So one would ask oneself, what happens to international law when there's a hegemonic system? That is, when the Soviet Union collapsed, now there's one center of power. Why would the US accept constraint on itself when there's no one externally to constrain it? This is what Stephen Walton was saying in the 90s. This would be the main challenge for the US. There's 500-pound gorilla and no one's there to constrain it. So we'll just run wild. This was and exhaust itself and make a lot of enemies. This was the main concern, because states don't constrain themselves. So what would international law look like? Well, there's all these new principles being introduced from the 90s. That is humanitarian intervention, which means we can use force, no constraint on us, but others cannot. We have a democracy promotion. You have this changing of borders with Kosovo. It's saying, well, it's not legal, but it's legitimate because we said so. You have the global war on terror, which, again, sovereignty for us, but not for you. This is kind of the principle. But this is kind of natural. If there's a hegemonic system, the hegemon wouldn't constrain itself. But I think the problem now is we're going into a multipolar system. We have to start to accept mutual constraint again. But I think Trump, he would like to restore hegemony. So, but there's no framework to do it. So, so it's just, might makes right, and extract, something from your allies. And we'll get what you want. I think that's the direction it's going. So it's going to be a phase to adjust to. So I don't think it would solely be Trump. I think not just the US as well as the Europeans have to adjust to what international law means in a multipolar world.
Well, follow the money. So the US has been able until last year to basically set the rules, set the table, because the world was dependent upon the dollar. Dollar hegemony, it ruled the day. But the transition away from the dollar really started in earnest in February, March of 2022, in the wake of the sanctions that were brought on Russia, the kicking Russia out of SWIFT, which, when you think back on it, the West did Russia a favor. Because SWIFT is the equivalent in the modern financial world of a buggy whip. That the only way you got to, if you're going to drive, imagine if you get into a car, you got to have a buggy whip. Now, the buggy whip doesn't do anything to make the car go, but you got to have it. And so that's how modern banks are having to use this ancient technology called email to send messages to get funds transferred. And a lot of times they get lost in spam and 2 or 3 days over. Anyway, the movement, the rise of BRICS in creating alternative payment methods where you no longer had to buy Russian oil with US dollars. The Chinese would pay in yuan and Russia would accept the yuan. But both countries then started buying more gold, and Russia in particular is a major gold producer. China is a major producer of silver. They began controlling these metals. We have seen, in the last 2 months, the explosion, particularly of silver. Yesterday at like 2:30 in the Sunday afternoon, silver was selling at $89, and by last night it was up to $93. I haven't had a chance to see what it's doing today, but I'd imagine it's going higher. And as this is taking place, countries, instead of buying more U.S. Treasury bills, which is a way to allow the rest of the world to finance the United States deficit, all the major countries are buying less. And it's not clear who's doing the buying, whether it's actually the Federal Reserve that's buying it up on its own or what. But the point of all this is the U.S. control of the economy is slipping away. And the U.S. is faced now with, when this war started in Ukraine, I think the U.S. national debt was around $36 trillion. It's now just hit $39 trillion, $3 trillion in 3 years, 4 years. That's growing very, very fast. And there's no sign that it's going to slow down, especially when we heard Trump announce he's going to increase defense spending to $1.5 trillion, up $500 billion from what it was. So you've got this phenomena now of Russia and China, where they are now economically, they're no longer dependent on the United States. They have managed to separate themselves from dependence on the U.S. dollar. Russia, by virtue of it's got the most natural resources of any country in the world, and is in a position to actually, take those resources out of the ground, get them into production, and sell them. And China, who is now leading the world in terms of industrial production and controlling supply chains around the world. This has put the United States at a real disadvantage. And that, what we're witnessing now is, as you remake this international financial order, you're going to remake the international political order. So up to this point, the United States was able, as they tried, as was shown on December 28th, they could crash the Iranian economy by collapsing the currency. I don't know specifically how they did it at this point, but I would note that it was, George Soros tried to do something like that to the UK. So if one guy like George Soros can do it, you have to recognize a country like the size of the United States can absolutely do it to a country that's the size of Iran. So this is where actually the next battle is being fought. It's in the economic markets. Gold is at an all-time high. Silver is at an all-time high, and there's no evidence that other countries are lining up to say, well, in fact, we saw Canada. Canada used to be one of the top 3 trading partners with the United States. And now, because of the conflict, it's solidifying its ties with China, distancing itself from the United States. That is, despite Trump's claims that, they got all these tariffs and they're working to control these other countries, the PR he puts out doesn't match up with the reality that's undergirding all this.
Well, it seems to be a very standard format at this point, though. That is, I think Iran was going down the Syrian path. That is, first use the economic weapon against them to, create economic havoc and political instability, then help to instigate, protests and a revolt. And then you can have 2 things happen. Either you're successful with you're managing or hijacking civil society by pushing for a coup, or the government push back, and then you can claim to come protect the people against their own government, and then of course the country will be destroyed and ripped apart while we talk about democracy and human rights. So it's we've seen this movie before. But I wanted to ask, though, more specifically about Greenland, because, why take Greenland? Like, I understand why they took out Syria, I understand why they want to take out Iran, but why take ownership over Greenland? Because the Danes with Greenland and the US are already allies in NATO. The Danes would mine more American bases there. Again, the Europeans have a massive case of Stockholm syndrome. After 80 years of being vassals, there's no political imagination to anything else than being ruled by Washington. So given that the Europeans are, willing to do anything that Washington says, why go to that extent and snatch the actual territory when the Europeans would be happy to, do whatever America tells them to?
Yeah, I'd like to give one simple reason. I don't think there is. It's really baffling. So one of the justifications is, the United States needs those rare earth minerals that China's withholding. We've got, you're going to have to still dig them out of the ground in Iceland or in Greenland, and then you've got to process them, and that's the problem. There, 40 miles from me, just north of, I'm in Bradenton, Florida. There's a mining company called Mosaic. Well, Mosaic's got ample supply. They've done all these gypsum mines. They've got all this material. It contains all the rare earth minerals. The problem is the U.S. doesn't have a processing plant, and the processing plant is very dirty and they're not environmentally friendly. And so getting one of those approved to be able to use is a whole nother problem. So the rare earth mineral case doesn't make sense. We want to get access to the Arctic. The United States has a total of 2 icebreakers, but only one is functioning. So they basically only have one functioning icebreaker. That's not going to get you anything in terms of being able to move in and out of the Arctic with any regularity. In contrast, the Russians have at least 8, and I don't know, I think maybe 5 of them, maybe 6 are nuclear powered, if not all. So, I mean, they've got world-class icebreakers for transiting that area in the winter when it freezes over. So, and again, there was we didn't have a single case where the United States made a request of Greenland and said, hey, could we expand our base? And Greenland said, hell no, or Denmark. No, we don't have that. Where they said, we'd like to bring in more personnel. Never rejected. So this is, I think this is more Donald Trump's personal vanity project. They're using the excuse of national security, but he'll probably name it Trump land. It's no longer Greenland; it's going to be Trump land. And I wouldn't be shocked to see that as one more way of catering to his vanity.
Yeah, I was wondering if he foresees the split of the political West and he wants to get ahead of the curve. Because if the world is becoming multipolar, then the U.S. will not be able to focus that much on Europe, so we'll have less to offer. Meanwhile, the Europeans, if they want to remain somewhat relevant, they will have to diversify ties, start to connect with other great powers. So you can kind of see that in the multipolar world, the political West isn't going to hold up anyways.
Right.
So, so you can make a strategic argument, I guess, that, well, it's better to snatch what you need to keep now as the alliance system breaks up, which is why he would also like to get the semiconductor factories in Taiwan and get them moved over to the US. If you think that the alliance system is not going to last. But I do think that there's a heavy element of narcissism there as well. Also his personal resentment for the EU. He calls it, they call him worse than China, which is also suggests that having to ask the Europeans to have their permission to have US troops in Greenland, if they would want to have any missile defense, they're spying on Russia, that they would need the permission. I think I think a lot of this could be about his personality as well.
Yeah. No, I don't think we can underestimate that at all as one of the primary motivations for this. It's all, look how obsessed he's been with, I've stopped 8 wars, which he hasn't, and I need the Nobel Peace Prize. The letter you referenced earlier to the deputy foreign minister of was it the deputy foreign minister of Norway?
No,
we got
the prime minister.
Oh, the prime minister, and the glee he demonstrated when Machado gives him the Nobel,
medal,
the medal. And it's like, really? I played on sports teams, and getting a medal or a trophy to me is no big deal. And I don't go to sleep at night saying, "Oh my God, I got to get this trophy or this award." He apparently does, which again, that's not normal. That is not normal behavior. And part of what I see taking place is we've got so many world leaders, and I'll frankly include Vladimir Putin in this as well, that are enabling this guy. I think the Russian position ought to be right now, and Putin essentially said this last week when he addressed the 32 ambassadors, that he, without calling out the United States by name, he just said that you really can't have a system where you disregard international law and you just make a law unto yourself. But part of that is just we say to Witkoff and Kushner, hey, we're going to deal strictly with international law. I need a commitment from you that the United States is going to follow that. And if not, we don't have anything to talk about. And start isolating the United States. And, through a concerted effort between China, India, Russia, and work with other countries to stop using U.S. dollars. That's the only thing. The money, you don't want to get into a physical war, a shooting war, but by God, you can cripple the United States financially, where it's going to have to pull back and rethink its approach. This is, I am genuinely alarmed by what Trump is saying, and he's being enabled by an entire crew of sycophants. And if this is not arrested and stopped, it is going to lead to a world war, a global war. I don't see how that's avoidable.
So just sad to watch him, I guess, take pleasure in getting someone else's medal. And of course, the great irony there, of course, as well. I mean, someone else wins it. And the only reason why she won it, I think, was because the Norwegians wanted to placate Trump by essentially giving him legitimacy to invade Venezuela by giving it to a dissident who openly called for invading her own country. But it has a precedent, though. I mean, there's in 1920, there was a Norwegian, Knut Hamsun, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he actually took his Nobel medal and he gave it to Joseph Goebbels in 1943. That is the Nazi propaganda minister, because he thought that, the Nazi propaganda minister was just the greatest guy ever. So, so there has been it has happened before.
Yeah, I mean, and that who it happened to tells you all everything you need to know about this. That basically Trump is on par with a Nazi propagandist. You can make that case.
Yeah, it's not good optics. But I want to ask you about the defense, though, of Greenland, because the Europeans they want to now show that they're not completely irrelevant. As you said, that they appear to be this abused spouse. They want to show that they can stand up to Donald Trump. So they said they would defend Greenland. They send a handful of troops.
Yeah.
And I mean, literally a handful of troops. The British sent one guy, the Norwegians sent two, and the Germans sent some more. But then the day after the Germans arrived, Trump said, "Now, well, if you try to resist annexation of Greenland, then we will tariff you all." So he put 10% tariff, and the day after the Germans left already. So I'm not sure. It's just I don't know. How do you interpret this? What was the purpose of all of this efforts to defend? I mean, is there any point to it, or is this just virtue signaling, or how are you assessing it?
I'm assessing it as this is a 21st century update of the Monty Python movie, The Knights of the Holy Grail. Okay, it's satirical, it's laughable, it's absurd, and yet the problem is it's real. Because in the Monty Python movie, when the knights would get clashing, they'd say, "Run away, run away." That's the Germans. I mean, we just saw the Germans do that. They landed and said, "Okay, we lasted 36 hours. Back on the plane, guys. Let's run away." Europe under the optimal conditions, if they wanted to get into a military conflict with the United States, they're a speed bump. They're not going to slow up the U.S. Now, if you're doing investing, this would have been a good time to invest in popcorn, because I'm sure the demand for it has gone up in Russia. They're just sitting there, buckets of popcorn, eating and watching. Instead of watching a great movie, they're watching this entire fiasco unfold with Europe trying to figure out, are we for or against the unilateral takeover of land so we're willing to support the U.S. in the war against Ukraine because Russia is violating international law by seizing territory in Ukraine, but we're going to look the other way when the United States takes a NATO country and strips it of its property, of its sovereign right, and we're not going to do anything. And some are saying, "Oh, well, we got to do something." And so this is it's all Kabuki theater. And, the only thing that's going to make a difference is if the Europeans finally unite and say, "Wait a second, this can't be allowed," and they start closing down U.S. military bases. They start denying U.S. access to places like Wiesbaden. I don't see England doing that at all. Germany's the one country where they could actually, turn the tables. And what would be? Let's come up with the most extreme scenario in which Merz goes, "Wait a second, we've taken enough abuse in this relationship. We're getting out. We're going back to Russia. We're going to buy Russian oil. We're going to buy Russian gas." My understanding is part of the Nord Stream pipeline is still functional, so they could still deliver gas to Germany. So if Germany immediately gets into paying for cheaper natural gas, cheaper oil, then they're in a position where they could stop their economic slide, which is underway. That might get the U.S. attention at that point. But knowing Trump, he's going to be so angered at that the effrontery of the Germans that he'll double down. But at this point, then you will see NATO will come apart at the seams. It's not going to be. There's no longer this much touted unity that really hasn't existed. And in tandem with that, I think you're going to see the acceleration of the Russian offensive against the Ukrainians. General Winter is really doing a number on them, as they've knocked out all the power plants, and the increasing number of Ukrainians are having to abandon cities like Kyiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv.
Yeah, well, I think it would make some sense for the Europeans. Fighting America directly does make any sense, but I think communicating that it would come at a high cost, I think that would be the main tool to move forward, of course. But it's a big gamble because the Europeans don't want the Americans to leave; they want them to stay. It's the Trump that's trying to pull it back. So their threat is essentially what Trump wants, which almost makes me think this is a ploy to reduce the relevance of NATO, because Trump can't do it on his own. Because you need Congress, you need. It's difficult to pull off, but if the Europeans does it for him, then it would work. I'm not saying this is the efforts, but overall, it seems that his erratic behavior often is, like I said, is escalation control. That is, he's able to escalate dramatically, and then people try to find a compromise. Because he doesn't mind war. I think he's more worried about forever wars. That is the costly wars which pulls in America and doesn't allow it to leave, because he seems to have an aversion for high cost, but he wants the low-hanging fruit. So we saw this with Panama. Give some threats, and then the Panamanian gave some concessions. We saw with Yemen when he was going to just knock them out. It didn't work. Okay, so he called it a quits. Okay, we're done with this. In Venezuela as well, just go in, kidnap the president, kill a lot of people, and then we're finished. Kiss and make up. Let's try to work with what remains of the government. Iran as well, just try to knock out its nuclear plants, try to do a decapitation strike, and then it didn't work. Okay, well, then we end it right away. So it seems this is the way to go. So if the Europeans would put some troops in Greenland, at least as a tripwire, that would forever damage relations with the Americans, or, threaten to and actually carry through on market access denial to U.S. companies in Europe, these kind of things. I think that would work. But the problem is Europe can't live without the United States. So
Right.
it would be very hollow. And again, any threat, I don't think will be followed through. But but it's, I was wondering also what you made of sense of the comment by the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, because she said after Trump put tariffs on the Europeans who sent the troops and started pushing back against annexation, she said that there obviously had been a misunderstanding, a communication problem, because the Europeans just sent those troops to Greenland to defend from Russia and China, because Trump had said that this was the problem, that they had to annex Greenland because Denmark can't defend it. So they were just sending them to help to do a Trump. This is where we're at. They're apologizing for setting up a deterrent to defend their own soil, and they're apologizing to Trump for it. This is where we are, though. But what do you make of this? Is this, of course, I could be mistaken. Maybe this is the real intent, but it doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't think anyone can imagine Russian or Chinese warships coming into Greenland and trying to annex it. It doesn't really make any sense at all.
Yeah, no, this is called putting lipstick on a pig, trying to make the pig look pretty, or, dress the pig up so it looks like some, starlet, like Marilyn Monroe from the old days. It is what I have to go with what I see. And this notion that Trump is involved with some sort of sophisticated 3D, three-dimensional chess game. Yet his comments are so abrasive, so insulting, or so threatening. I mean, they fall in one of those three categories, that he's not doing things in a way that he can help people save face. He can he's willing to, if you will, take the high road and allow people to have an exit strategy. No, his is all just bare knuckle force, and almost forcing people to some of these leaders to debase themselves or to accept insult after insult. And that you might be able to get away with that once, but you can't keep getting away with it, because at some point they'll punch back, they'll seek revenge, they'll find a way to stab you in the back or sandbag you, and so Trump is weak. I view what Trump is doing, in my view, is he is dramatically weakening the ability of the United States to continue to exercise this hegemonic influence in the world. And instead of, again, he's using tariffs as a political club. And, historically, tariffs have been used successfully when they're used for an economic purpose, where one country is severely disadvantaged by the economic capacity of the other country, or what it produces, trades, etc. So you can use tariffs in order to defend your own domestic production. But when you turn tariffs into a political tool, one of punishment and coercion, that only works if you have the monopoly control over a product or over the currency. And that's no longer the case. And so what's happening, and we saw it again, I referenced it with Canada. Canada starts saying, they've been taking this abuse, and they said, okay, screw it. We're going to build up our relationship with China. And it's not going to be immediate overnight, the transformation, but a year from now, you're going to have more Chinese vehicles being imported into Canada, being sold to Canadians, and fewer U.S. vehicles, which is going to hurt the U.S. automobile industry. And China's already got an enormous advantage over the United States in regards to that. So, and likewise with India, the threats against India have backfired. India's not working to change its policies to accommodate the United States. It's looking out for new trading partners and say, okay, we'll have to live without them. So when Trump labored under this false belief that the United States was so powerful and such an essential, we were an essential business, economic, military power that nobody could live without us, all of a sudden he's discovering that a lot of these countries are saying, yeah, no, we can live without you. And in fact, we have fewer, the more we distance ourselves from you, the fewer problems we have, which is why, again, I liken it to that abusive spouse relationship because, it is dysfunctional and it's almost like an addictive personality disorder. And it's not until somebody gets to a point where they say, I got to break free, and they find that they can break free and go on and find a new life. So we're in that kind of transitional moment in history. Looking back on this period from February of 2022, and I think through December of 2026, we'll be seeing as consequential a move and change in the international arena as what took place from, May 1945 through the December of 1948, that kind of dramatic change.
Well, I can't make up my mind, though, whether Trump is unstable or he's pretending to be unstable. But I don't think it matters because, as you said, either way, you can't trust him anymore. And, well, the case that he pretends, I wonder if he's following the Richard Nixon's madman approach. That is, if you act irrational and extreme, then you can escalate and control the escalation ladder, because you can escalate and put massive pressure on others, but then you can also bring it down because nobody wants this kind of confrontation with a madman. So being unpredictable and going up the escalation ladder and essentially compelling others to back down and make a compromise because they fear the disastrous outcome of someone who is unstable. It's there's some benefit to appearing unstable, but but it is political theater, which is why many countries would like to do anything Trump says simply to avoid a direct conflict, because you can't calculate how he will behave like his predecessor. So, and you do see to some extent it works. I mean, the Europeans does whatever they can now to avoid any conflicts with Trump. They just hope that Trump do what he wants, and then he will direct his unpredictable fury towards the Russians. The Russians seems to be playing along as well with this charade by Trump's diplomacy, so he will direct his fury in the other direction towards the Europeans and Zelensky. But so you end up going this: one day it's everything Zelensky's fault, the next day he's disappointed in Putin. I don't even remember where he's at the moment, but I don't think it matters. He just jumps back and forth. But my point is, if it's real instability or not, nobody will trust you at the end. So the Russians, I think, made up their mind already. No, it doesn't matter what paper they sign. There will be a new deal the next day. So I think, this. I think it's a flawed strategy, and it didn't work that well under Nixon either. But let me just ask a last question because you started talking about the economics of the whole thing, and with this just slapping tariffs on the Europeans now say that they might retaliate with this $93 billion tariffs on the United States. They might not follow through with it, but either way, just the U.S. tariffs alone. When can this spark a financial crisis? Do you see this as likely?
Yeah, actually, I do. I think so. There is. I came across a YouTube video last night. It's called Metals and Markets. Now, the analyst, and I think it's an AI generated analyst. So it's not a real person, and the delivery is very smooth, very professional, very coherent, which tells you that it's a script that's been written. My reading of it now is that it is probably written by the Chinese, but it reflects what they're talking about is that because of Trump's tariffs, it's likely it has created a real imbalance in the market, particularly with respect to silver. And what gave me some confidence that this was not just some artificial intelligence propaganda is that this video was ostensibly recorded Sunday afternoon at 2:38 p.m. Eastern time. And the price of silver on the spot market with them was like 89. And the guy was saying, well, it could go down a little bit, but within 8 hours, that number was up to 93. So, it moved up $4. I haven't looked at it today yet at this time, but if it's continuing to move up, then you've got a problem with silver. The demand, it's out of whack. And China has already put a limit on silver exports. They've restricted that. So I think and you're seeing fewer countries buying U.S. treasuries. In the past, the United States was able to finance its wars, finance its government by selling U.S. debt to foreign countries, and these foreign countries would buy it up because they thought, oh, the United States is a safe place. They'll always pay their debts. Now you're seeing it just moving in the opposite direction, and you're seeing particularly Russia, China, India, they're buying more precious metals for their own stores, and as are a number of other nations. So these are all sending signals that there is a looming financial crisis on the horizon. And, I love to do movie analogies because I always think they reveal some truth. Asking whether Donald Trump is crazy is like asking whether the character that Mel Gibson played in the movie Lethal Weapon, whether he was crazy. And, you saw him at various points where he would act crazy. And then when nobody was around, he was getting ready to put a gun in his mouth to kill himself. So he was not the kind of guy that you would sit down and say he's a stable person. And I think that's what we're seeing with Trump. We've got evidence going back to his first term in Washington in 2017. He has repeatedly demonstrated that he is a complete failure when it comes to selecting people to include in his government, or almost a complete failure. He has a knack for choosing the wrong people, or for choosing people that will actually work to undermine him, or people that are not competent. And we saw that whether, when he put Gina Haspel in charge of the CIA, Christopher Wray in charge of the FBI. We've seen it now putting Pete Hegseth and changing it to the Department of War. So, and I put myself in the position, if I'm an analyst for Russian intelligence or Chinese intelligence, and I have to go in and make an assessment to President Putin or President Xi about what kind of person is Donald Trump. Can you trust him? Is he willing to make a deal and stick to it? Is his ultimate objective just burnishing putting his name on everything so he looks like a winner? Or is he actually sort of a creature dependent upon the deep state that is intent upon destroying Russia and or China? And, my own opinion, I have to come in with the latter. I think Trump has become a convenient tool. He's not setting the agenda. He's not running the chessboard. But he's certainly enabling this effort to weaken China and weaken Russia, because there are those driving the bus that still believe that they both represent the key threat that we have to stop. Not figure out how can we work with Russia and China to make all countries wealthy. How can we work with Russia and China so that we don't have to have a $1.5 trillion defense budget? How do we work with Russia and China to promote and build infrastructure in countries around the world? There's not that attitude in the West. It's always, we win, you lose. It's a zero-sum game. And as long as that mentality continues to preside and reign over whoever's in office, the United States is in a trap that I don't think we're going to get out of.
Yeah, well, I think that's another adjustment from hegemony to multipolarities. In a hegemonic system, you don't have to take into account the security of others. You just have to make sure you're so powerful. It doesn't matter if they feel threatened or not. They just have to adjust to new realities. Right. But in the multipolar world, you do have to, and again, this goes back to Peace of Westphalia. If you want security for yourself, you need to make sure you don't threaten the security of others as well. I think this is going to be a hard adjustment to make. And in the meantime, I think this main shift is going, as you suggested, in the economic sphere as well. The fact that silver is also exploding at the moment, I think it's also because it's being used actually in manufacturing by the Chinese. So it's there's more demand than their supply. But keep in mind that only back in September, the silver hit about $40. Now it's at the 95. So this is the history of silver essentially, and then the just past months is taking off, and it's not coming down. So we're to have all these different wars around the world. It will, I think, within the next few months, it will be coupled with a massive financial crisis, and that's going to add a big uncertain variable into the whole mess. It's going to make it be very difficult to control. So thank you as always, and visit Solar 21.
Yeah, I would say on that cheery note.
It's very hard to. Well, this has been a rough year so far. The first almost 3 weeks of it. So it's. I really hope it comes down.
We're 19 days in, and everybody's already screaming, "Stop the ride! I want to get off."
Yeah, it is. No, it's strange. It doesn't. As you said, if someone would have told you this a few years ago, that this is where we would be, it would sound a bit like science fiction. But
well, yes. I'll make a prediction. Before the year is out, I think you'll find more European countries will have revived relationships with Russia, and there will be a freeze on relationships with the United States.
Well, I think if they want to have more independence, they have to reduce their dependence on the US. That means economic trade with others, get Russian energy, but also the dividing lines in Europe were recreated after the Cold War to cement the position of the US in Europe. But now it's just making us even more dependent. So while the Europeans are trying to keep the war going, they should do the exact opposite, put a quick end to it so it's less dependence. And but it is interesting to see how the Europeans suddenly were shocked, because only the past year of the Trump presidency, we had this attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent. We had the slaughter in Gaza, the attack on Iran, the bombing of Nigeria, the kidnapping of the president of Venezuela, threatening Cuba, Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, and suddenly everyone is in shock because